Howdy, 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 howdy. Welcome, everybody. It's been a while since I've been on this, so let's make sure everyone hear me all right? Sounds okay. Make sure this is working. Welcome. um, let everyone trickle. Okay, it's working. Here we go. I sound okay? Sounds great. Perfect. I haven't made a video in a while, so probably should have tested that before I got on here, but screw it. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Kind of let people trickle in. We'll look through some of the pictures I've been sharing. Again, if you, um, in the days leading up to the show, I like to post just little teasers of things that I'm going to be talking about and show some interesting old pictures that I've come across um, on Twitter. You don't like Twitter, no problem. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can follow me on Twitter. You don't need an account, and you can kind of get a taste of what the episode's gonna um, cover. But yeah, for those of you that have been with me through enough of these episodes, you kind of know my sweet spot, right? Buried buildings, undergrounds, giants, out of place relics, altered timelines, blah 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 blah. You know, it's kind of the same stuff, but yeah. So let's see who's in here. Lone Star, good to see you again. Old World Micmac, hope you're still around. This will be a good one. Lots of material, I'm sure, that'll be in your wheelhouse. Another sob. Many Feathers, good to see you. It's been a while. Benny Riley, good to see you. Smoking Chiba, welcome. Carol, good to see you, Carol. Yeah, you're always commenting, so I'm glad you caught alive. Did you look at the Washburn Water Tower? I did, but I'm not gonna. I won't cover that so much on this. Again, I have to cut so much out to fit it into 90-ish, 100-ish minutes. So I think one of the biggest comments is locals that I missed something, and I'm sure I'm going to. My plan in the future is to do more of like an edited video, kind of a synopsis video, around 30 minutes. It'll be kind of just me talking over um, pictures, the pictures being the themes of the articles, and to go back to some things that I didn't get to. But yeah, Leighton Lexicon, good to see you. Rothrods, welcome. Jillian, thank goodness I have one mod. Good to see you, Jillian. Thanks for being here. X Factor, good to see you. Grimerica was great. Oh man, I felt like I was stumbled a little bit in the Grimerica one. I really hope they have me back. They seemed like they were interested, but nothing scheduled yet. The hard thing when I when I get on a show with somebody, and by the way, if you guys haven't seen, I did a recent talk with Grimerica. It's on their channel. You can check that out. Also, stay tuned. I just finished a talk with Tinfoil Hat, so hopefully that'll be up soon. They didn't give me a date on upload, but also a good one. So yeah, with the Grimerica talk, when I meet gentlemen that aren't familiar with my work or haven't seen my videos, I have to like start out with like a kind of a summary, and I end up just talking about a little bit of all the different subject matter that I cover, and I don't ever get to like really I don't ever have enough time to dive into actual material, and so it's kind of hard. They hear me talking about some of these kind of outlandish things, and for those of you that have seen enough of these episodes, it's far from limited when it comes to the material and how much of this stuff is actually out there and accessible, and the sheer quantity at this point, 20 episodes in, it's pretty crazy. But yeah, I loved talking to those guys. I've listened to their podcasts several times over the last, I don't even know, decade, I think, maybe. And so it was really an honor. Hopefully, I can come back on and they can pick a specific subject matter, or maybe they'll have scenes. They weren't familiar with my material really at all. So it wasn't like they had a specific thing they wanted to talk about. So, if I'm lucky enough, I'll be back on and we can kind of narrow that focus down. Oklahoma episode, yeah. Oklahoma is going to be a good one. I have a lot of good material for Oklahoma. We're getting there. Like I had mentioned a few episodes ago, I wanted to finish off the Mississippi. That's why we're in Minnesota. I believe next episode's probably going to be Wisconsin. Not 100%, but 90%. And then we're going to kind of spend some more time on the Missouri River. We'll get to Oklahoma, I promise. Just listen to you on THC. Gramerica, love what you do. Thanks. Yeah. Higher side chats for anybody in the chat that hasn't seen my talks with Greg at the higher side chat. I've done 3 now. And the beautiful thing with Greg was that he was very familiar with my work, so we jumped right into material, and he had picked some of his favorites. So it was, it was a little more juicy, so to say. So yeah, hopefully, again, the tinfoil hat guys liked what I had to say, and I can come back on and actually dive into some material. Same with the Gramerica guys. But yeah, so again, stay tuned for my tinfoil hat talk. Again, it was like 90 minutes. It's certainly not enough time. As you've seen with just covering one state, 90 minutes isn't nearly enough. So, but yeah. Oh, Stellium, good to see you. Love you, brother. It's super late for you. I'm glad you hopped in. Oh, Larry, good to see you as well. Lots of familiar faces in this one. That makes me happy. But yeah, so like I said, we're going to just start off with kind of rolling through the Twitter thread, just looking at some of my favorite pictures. Just kind of warm you all up for what we're going to be talking about. And then we'll jump right in. As always, I have plenty to talk about, and I'm sure we won't get to it all. So I've organized them by kind of priority in my mind. But yeah. So yeah, let's go ahead and share this stuff out. Welcome everybody. Episode 21, Minnesota. We're going to jump into some old photos. Again, like I was mentioning for some of you earlier, I start a thread and then I just add to it as I get closer to the episode. Usually I post the whole week, but that certainly wasn't the case this week. I was super backlogged and my youngest son had a fever, and it's just, a million things. Work, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, here we go. Some old pictures. These are late, anywhere from 1860s to 1890s. Capitol building. I just love whenever I can get a picture. It's like you got a fire hydrant, but you got a horse and buggy here. It's like so conflicting. Power lines. Beautiful one with the clock. This is like probably my favorite representation of kind of the things I've been mentioning over the series so far, and it brings me back to my home capital of Salem, Oregon. Very much like this, where you literally have these unbelievable buildings. If something like this was being built in your city, you probably know about it, or it would at least be openly discussed. And it's just in the middle of a field with tiny little trees. Like that's the extent. And this is like so common. Again, steps leading up to the first level. And plenty of you are familiar with the mud flood thing. And there's good representations and mediocre representations, but there's a lot of buildings in whatever city any of you guys are from. Old World, Florida, good to see you. Miss you, Longo. Haven't heard from you in a while. Hope all is well. So yeah, this is really common, especially in Iowa. We saw a lot of this. A lot of these prairie breadbasket states. It's just buildings in the middle of fields, dirt paths, lightly worn. You know, this is the Cathedral, St. Paul. The quotation for this one is the end of construction. So you know how I feel about construction photos. They often have an air of editedness to them, but supposedly they haven't put the stained glass in yet, which looks to be the case, but still a crazy building. This is probably my favorite mud flutter. You know, you got a whole empty level where they've just piled up stones and this really rude, there's not even, a, a, a deck or anything. It's just stairs, piled up stones. Um, yeah, building windows that are shortened. Some drawings here, getting the same type of idea. This is somebody's private home. One of the oldest bridges here. Um, I want to say this is Minneapolis. I usually put up a lot of bird's eye views maps, but somehow I misplaced that folder. But I tend on adding them later on, maybe after this episode, to my thread on Twitter if you're interested in seeing what the towns looked like in the late 1800s. Here are some asylums. Believe it or not, in the late 1800s, there were over 20 asylums in Minnesota. 20, over 20. And they were all the biggest buildings in the state. So, how much sense does that make? Right? But you find that in a lot of states. You know, my home state, one of the biggest buildings in the 1800s was an asylum in Pendleton. Same thing here. Look at the size of this. Again, late 1800s. I mean, this is unbelievable. The biggest buildings in every city in America were almost always mental asylums. This one is really interesting because you see these two buildings, there's actually like 10 of them all built in a semicircle. Huge. Again, half covered windows, stairs leading to the first level. And they're all the exact same. There's like 10 of them built in a semicircle. Same thing, half covered windows, stairs leading up. But, let alone, you don't even need to bring, silly ideas, however you feel about mud flood or any of that stuff, right? But um, just the asylum narrative. Like, let's just say I stopped talking about giants and buried cities and, what lies beneath. And we just made the channel talking about the mental health crisis of the 1800s and the workforce and the labor and the materials and all of these things that are required to build these buildings in this time period. Again, all young trees, no old trees. The idea is, again, that the forest was clear cut and this was put there, but I just don't believe that for a second. So yeah, again, just the size. This is an actual photo, although some of our drawings, the size is just crazy. This, I believe, still exists. I can't remember the name of it. It's abandoned. Here are some mining photos. Believe it or not, Minnesota was like one of the highest grossing mining states in all of America in this time frame, which I didn't know until I started digging into Minnesota and was blown away. I was pretty well aware of the sheer amount of grain that was being shipped out of Minnesota, but the amount of mining materials. I mean, Minnesota was furnishing the iron for a huge percentage of the eastern United States as well as Europe. At the time, so this is all of the same. Uh, the Masaba open pit mine. These are all pictures from the open pit mine. It At the time it was the largest open pit mine in the world. And yeah, I apologize again for small and poor image quality in some cases, but you get the idea. I mean, we're talking 100 feet down and even larger in some cases, probably 200, 300 feet down. Um, but yeah, crazy. Um, they found all kinds of incredible minerals here in Minnesota. Um, in fact, one of the largest mercury deposits ever found was from Minnesota, which was surprising to me as well. Um, Diamonds, which we'll get into later. Uh, so Minnesota never hosted the expositions that we're generally used to, right? When it comes to talking about expositions, um, they had what was called the Industrial Exposition, and they had three main buildings, and this being the main one. This is the one that they always advertised when it came to, or shown when advertised. But again, when we're looking at the buildings that I've been showing, when we're looking at the asylums, when we're looking at, these types of buildings to the current population, things are a bit askew. This was one I'd never heard of. I've heard of this in China, I believe, and I know there was one in Russia, but I wasn't aware that there was a ice palace and a winter carnival held in St. Paul every year. I believe the first one was 1886, but they built this giant palace out of ice, and every year it was a little bit different. Um, Completely made out of ice. 194 feet wide, 217 feet long. Pretty incredible. Um, and again, for anybody that wants, more of a particular subject, there's a pretty good amount of material out there for these ice palaces. Um, but yeah, just look at the flags. It's like the Templar flag. You got the Red Star flag. Um, oh, thank you, David. Appreciate that very much. And also, what's really interesting as well to me is you see that all of these huge mansions surrounding this ice palace. I had hard time finding better images to see, but I mean, look at the houses here are just huge, and they're all scattered around. This quality of this one was horrible, so I apologize there. But yeah, if this sticks out to you, I would definitely check this out: the Ice Palace, the Winter Carnival, King Borealis. Every year they picked a new carnival king. It was very similar to Mardi Gras, lots of similar overlays, and I talked about the history of Mardi Gras a little bit in my Louisiana episode. Um, but yeah, King Borealis, super interesting. Um, I would definitely check that out more if that interests you because some of these ice palaces are crazy. Um, I think in the late 1800s, late 1880s, they've illuminated it, so they had electric lighting through it, which it looked insane. Here are some natives: Minnesota, Chippewa, Sioux, and I can't remember what the third one. Ojibwe. Again, very much different. These drawings, G.A. King, D.A. King. I can't remember the name of the gentleman. But all these, I share his images in just about every episode. From Florida to Georgia to Louisiana, Iowa. He drew natives all around the United States, and kind of breaking down their name and their garb, clothes they're wearing. Quite different to what I was told and my understanding, but quite interesting. Look at the Sioux sword here, the saber. I talked about the saber when I was comparing some of the kind of Moorish clothing options that existed in some of these Indian tribes, especially the Creeks and the Seminoles. But they were often shown holding the saber, which is a really interesting cultural overlay. Yeah, so I'll share one more here, and then get into the larger form articles. This is a sign here at Indian burial mounds. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially what it says is that, the mound builder culture existed between 1500 and 2000 years ago. And archaeologists today believe the original mound builders of these mounds must have been Hopewellian culture, similar to the groups in the Ohio. Similar, sure, but there are many differences. But yeah, it goes on to say that these are now protected. So, um, here's a picture from the late 1800s of this park before they changed the layout quite drastically. And it's these trees have all matured, so it's pretty grown over. But you can see the mounds, and they all have worn paths up to the top in these spirals. Very interesting. Um, if you remember in my Iowa episode, for those of you that saw it, I talked about these spiral pathways that they would walk on and that they could hear, they would speak to their ancestors. Um, Ancestor worship, very common in Asiatic countries, very prominent here in America as well. Go figure. But a great picture, I thought, because this is going to get really important, and you'll see why, as I've said in many episodes. Let's just read through chat really quick. I do a horrible job of doing that. Um, Again, David, thank you for that one gifted. I appreciate it very much. That's my grandfather's ice palace. What? Rock and rolla. Welcome, rock and rolla. I do love architecture, though. Those buildings are amazing. Beautiful books and illustrations. Nothing these to try and find later. Yeah, for sure. Definitely dig deeper. That's all I'm trying to do. Inspire people to look and find things for themselves. Certainly not trying to convince anybody of anything. Modern Arabic, the Masonic version. Yeah, you get it. I've talked about it before. Um, that's why I recommend. Oh, thanks, Paul. Yeah. All right. Moving on. Here we go. Minnesota mound builders. Evidences of their work in the valley of the Zumbro River. On the north side of the Zumbro Valley in Section 10, Glasgow Town, are hundreds of mounds built by the mound builders in prehistoric ages. Some are in perfect condition, while others are partially or entirely destroyed. They extend from the point of a terrace formation or beach back over a half mile towards the west, and from the south side of the terrace towards the north nearly the same distance, forming a sort of circle. This terrace seems to have been at one time the bank of the river. The largest mounds are along the brow of the terrace and on the outskirts of the village or group of mounds. So although this is in a different area than the park I had originally showed you, they're describing a very similar thing. The mounds are all up on the highest part of the brow of the overlook. Back of the group of large mounds is one which is of usual round shape, but having a curved arm or wing on either side, suggesting the form of a bird. Next, back of these runs a long embankment broken at intervals, formerly 3 or 4 feet high, but now partially destroyed. This is now covered by a grove of oak. Now, this is really interesting. I don't think there's a coincidence with the oak trees. Um, Again, I kind of covered the symbology of the oak, especially when it comes to funeral rites and how so many cultures held the oak sacred, and I think these are planted. But yeah, relating it again to Jupiter and how you find skulls often planted with the oak tree. The oak tree was synonymous with Jupiter, had a lot of kind of Herculean overlays as well. Scattered on the concave side of the circle of mounds, especially near the point of the terrace, are hundreds of smaller mounds arranged more or less regularly and 30 to 50 feet apart. A large part of the site is now occupied by growing crops. So again, like we discussed earlier, these they don't care at all. Um, they just plow them over and keep farming. Many are of entirely different material from the soil around them. The soil of the terrace is a very sandy loam, which many of the mounds are made of a stiff clay, which is not found in the neighborhood. The original use of these mounds was probably for dwellings, as I've stated so many times before, and we'll get into further material in this episode. But again, going all the way back to episode 1, um, where they are like, "Look at all these burial mounds," and then they actually start digging into them, and they find, "Oh my goodness, 9 out of 10 of these burial mounds are actually dwellings." So these are buried dwellings, and I think that's the case for most of them. There are even representations going back through some of my episodes where um, the dwelling, the home, was buried, and then a later culture then buried their dead on top of this mound. This is found in Colorado. This is found in Mississippi and in Arkansas, where it's just a normal burial mound, typical burial mound. We went in, we go down 3 feet, we find skeletons. Well, in some cases, okay, it's time to plow this, or the railroad needs to clear this thing out, and they go 20, 30, 40 feet into this mound, and they find a stone building or a stone pyramid, like in Texas, Mississippi, St. Louis, um, and on and on and on. So I think that a lot of the mounds, not think, but as many of these articles have shown, are the tops of actual dwellings. The best example of this, going back to the Colorado episode, was a giant mound. They didn't even call it a mound. They thought it was an actual mount, not a mountain. It wasn't that large, but a hill. And it was a 300 room building. So again, why I started off showing this is, are we just looking at dwellings on the top of this ridge? It's hard to say. These are protected now. You can't look at them. But going back through the material, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that, again, some are absolutely burials, but many of them are buried cities, buried villages. The original UK, yeah. The theory is advanced by the fact that not long ago, while excavating a mound for the cellar of the store of Dumfries, charred limestone was found 6 feet below the surface, evidently the remains of a fireplace, and suggesting the theory that these were partially subterranean dwellings. And the comparatively small size of the remains above ground strengthens the conclusion. Yeah. I mean, again, looking at the buildings, when we talk about mud flood and how these buildings look like they're a bit top heavy, architecturally they don't quite make sense, statistically, workforce, population, what, on and on and on, right? Just look at that first asylum building I showed you and think, okay, Minnesota, and that's in a small town. Like, that's not in Minneapolis or St. Paul, that's out in the middle of nowhere. They're building a literal 1,000 room building in the late 1800s to house all the mental patients. And there's 23 of them, and all of them are monumental in size. So I got one little one here. Mankato, Minnesota. The Minnesota Historical Society is to investigations next month in the township of Cambria, where have been found evidences of habitations that are believed to date back earlier than the Indians. Such excavations have been made. Such excavations have brought to light many implements of domestic use as well as warfare and much pottery. Some signs of an early civilization have been discovered. It is thought by some scientists there is a connection between the buried homes found in this country or in this county and those lately uncovered near St. Louis. So, again, really important, right? He's making the same connection that we're showing in this series, that, oh, the buried cities that we're finding in St. Louis have a connection with the buried cities that we're finding here in Minnesota. And I agree. So yeah, now we're going to jump into some of the longer form stuff. We'll get into these shorter articles if time permits. Again, those of you that do follow my Twitter, you can see what I miss here. Odds are I won't get to it all. But yeah, so we're gonna jump into. If you remember in the Iowa episode, I spent a large majority of my time talking about the the runic inscriptions and the tablet calendar stones found in Iowa, as well as Rock Island, right across the bridge from where they found these runic calendar stones. Again, connecting the same dots with um, Phoenician ships were traveling all the way up to, I think, Minnesota, the Great Lakes, obviously, right? Because who was responsible for the the seafaring transportation of not only the grain and flintstone of Minnesota, but also the copper of Michigan, many other things. But yeah, so that's where we ended in Iowa, and we're going to keep that kind of runic uh, tablet inscription narrative going. And we're going to start talking about the Kensington runestone, probably a subject that you've heard me mention before as I brought it up when I was talking about the burials. I mentioned it lightly in my Buried Empires series. And yeah, we're going to get into a pretty great description of it here. I think I'm going to go full here, see if it is any better for you guys. No, it is not. So stupid. StreamYard needs to have an option where I can make my window actually cover the whole screen and not be this format. So I'm going to make sure I zoom in as best I can so you guys can see what I'm talking about here. So yeah, mystery of the Kensington runestone. Did Norsemen in 1362 leave the boulder in Minnesota that now sets archaeologists at loggerheads? Read this description here. Was there recently found in a spot thickly settled with Swedes and Norwegians the most important historical document bearing upon America's history? Or is this inscribed stone a fake to be classed with the Cardiff Giant and other frauds? A stone bearing strange runes has been found in Minnesota. Probably, hopefully, you can see that. Let me know if you guys can see that. For those of you that actually want to see what I'm reading, I'm sure many of you probably don't, but just in case. Yeah. The main question is whether or not it is a genuine runestone, chiseled some 5.5 centuries ago. If a really, truly runestone it is, a valuable and remarkable record of it furnishes the basis for the assertion that long before the discovery of America by Columbus, this part of the country was visited by Norsemen, and it will be a remarkable coincidence that this century sees their hardy descendants in a territory explored by these pathfinders hundreds of years ago. Now, I kind of tried to time my Minnesota episode with the Iowa material and the runestones, as well as me starting the Ireland the Great Buried Empires series, where I dive deeper into exploring the idea, in the 1500s, 1300s, the same time period, why the Norsemen called America Ireland the Great, Ireland Mikla, and why there's so much supporting evidence for this. And I think a lot of this overlays, again, talking about the Phoenicians in Iowa, St. Louis, Louisiana. We're just following up the Mississippi, and it's not too big of a bridge to build to think that they explored all the way this far up the river. Few persons outside of Minnesota realize the number and influence of the Swedes and Norwegians in the state. So there was a huge population of Swedes, Norwegians. There was a great population of Finnish people. There were a lot of Celtic people. There were a lot of German people. This is kind of like pretty normal for America. That's like you're running melting pot of quote Europeans. The real question is there a historical uh, is there historical evidence to support um, them being here long, long, long before the kind of repopulating event that took place, in the 1800s? The people born in Sweden now residing in Minnesota constitute more than 6% of the total population, and Norway contributes more than 5%. In at least 29 counties, the Norwegian born citizen are the largest element of the foreign population, and the Swedes predominate in 25 counties. This makes a tremendous showing when political elections are held and men of these nationalities have gained prominence in the state affairs. The late Governor Johnson, to whom a monument will soon be erected in St. Paul, was a Swede. Senator Newt Nelson, Ella Swinson, Minister to Switzerland, Governor Lind, Governor Einhardt, and other officials are Swedes and Norwegians. I mean, this is kind of normal to talk about now, the idea, the Minnesota Vikings, right? That there was a strong Scandinavian population in Minnesota. But 5%, 6%, one could enumerate many who have attained distinction in political education or professional life, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to kind of skip ahead for the sake of time and getting to as much material as possible. Where did it? Minister pamphlet. Okay. The story of this remarkable exhibit is an interesting one. So what they're talking about is the stone was put in the Capitol building on display. In August of 1898, a Swedish farmer, Olof Oman, while clearing his farm of stumps, unearthed a stone bearing strange hieroglyphics. As the farm is about 3 miles from the village of Kensington in Douglas County, Minnesota, the boulder has since been called the Kensington Runestone. The rock is of gray whack, dark in color, apparently a relic of the glacial drift, and is about 30 inches long, 16 inches, and 6 inches wide. It weighs 230 odd pounds, and with the exception of a few scratches, which may have been caused by hitting other boulders, the surface is free from any mark save the peculiar inscription, which several professors and archaeologists assert are runes. These letters form 9 lines on the face of the stone and 3 lines on the edge. If they have been correctly translated, they convey the astonishing information that the runes are a record of an exploring party of Norsemen who came to the western continent and to the part now called Minnesota in 1362. When the stone was first discovered by Oman, some degree of publicity was given it, and it was sent to Chicago, where it was viewed by persons versed in Swedish and Norwegian lore. And it was impossible to translate all of the inscription, and the stone was so far inland, these authorities gave it as their opinion that it was a fake. According to the boulder was returned Accordingly, the boulder was returned to Oman, who threw it down for a stepping stone to his granary door. It remained in obscurity until Hamler Rude Holland of Ephraim, Wisconsin, a graduate and postgraduate of the University of Wisconsin, became interested in it through researches into the history of the Norwegian immigration to this country. He was recently announced that, in his opinion, this is a genuine runestone and the most important historical record in America. According to his translation, the stone reads as follows. Okay, there it is, the translation. Sorry about that. Hard to follow along. Here's the translation. 8 Goths, Swedes, and 22 Norwegians, upon a journey of discovery from Vinland westward. Now remember, this is why, again, trying to correlate Buried Empires, Ireland the Great, with this timing, right? Because they called America Ireland the Great, and they also called it Vinland. And in my next episode of that, Ireland the Great, we're going to get into Norumbega, this mysterious vanished city that was the capital of Vinland westward, which was supposed to. Vinland has a very waxing and waning description as far as territory. Um, it was also called Florida, which is very interesting. Um, but yeah, so here you have an inscription saying they came from the west from Vinland. And why that's interesting, because later, as we get farther in this description, the time frame is what they say is that doesn't make sense because of the time frame. We had a camp of 2 skurries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out fishing one day. When we returned home, we found 10 men, red with blood and dead. On its edge is inscribed, "We have 10 men by sea to looking after our vessel. 14 days' journey from this island, year 1362." Since Mr. Holland's translation and championship of the stone, he has taken it to Chicago and other places and returned. I apologize, it's hard to see upon it. There are those who are confident it is genuine and others who proclaim it is a modern inscription. Professor N.H. Winchell, state geologist of Minnesota for 30 years, is one of its advocates, and he and Mr. Holland intend to take it to Christiana, that runologist from lending nearby universities. Again, I apologize, I can't see what it says. Pass the final word upon it. In one other way, we can the stone's genuineness be proved. In old histories of Canada, there are accounts of Varin Varendryer, a French explorer who formed an expedition to the south of Canada. His records show that in 2 or 3 places between the Red and Missouri rivers, there were pillars of stone. Some of these were isolated and others in groups, but they were evidently placed by some party who had reached this country before Varendryer. In one instance, they found a stone inscribed with strange characters. This was sent to France by the exploring party, and it is thought the markings were runes. And the markings on this stone agree with those of the Kensington rune stone. It would go far to prove the genuineness of the Kensington find. With this idea in view, a letter has been sent from Governor Ebhart of Minnesota to our minister in France asking if the stone can be found, as probably at the time of the French Revolution it became misplaced. Yeah, like all of the relics in the French Revolution. Oman is a plain Swedish farmer, a little education, and with an honest bearing. He states that he found the stone on an elevation of ground and that a popular poplar tree had entwined its roots about it. The record states that the stone was on an island, and this moraine hill on which Oman found the stone is now surrounded by a marsh. Interesting. So the river level was higher, which is again something I've talked about quite a lot, that the water level was definitely higher. The gradual drying up of the country in western Minnesota is well known. There is also no doubt that the locality being once infested with redmen or Indians. There is no evidence that it is an imposter or he carved the stone himself. So something else I wanted to talk about too is that as we get deeper into the Ireland the Great stuff, and we're going to kind of break down some of the Ojibwe, Sayu, Dakota languages and show some pretty interesting correlations. But um, Irish people, there was a society in Minnesota called the Ancient Hibernians, and it was a group of Celtic uh, Catholics, and would go on hunting parties, and they were led into the northern wilderness by Ojibwe and sometimes Sayu chiefs, and they could speak with these Indians, Ojibwe, Sayu. They said Celtic and Ojibwe were almost interchangeable, as well as Sayu, and even Dakota had a little bit of correlation. So something to keep in mind um, as we get farther along here. That again, how can the understand? How can these Aboriginal cultures here in Minnesota understand Celtic? Right. This is something I've mentioned so many times before when we talk about the Phoenicians. Who were the Phoenicians? Well, they weren't a race of people. They were a kind of society of mariners, of traders. and they covered the gamut. They were Swedes, they were Norse, they were Celtic, they were Berber, North African, right? Phoenician was all kinds of things. And why could all of those people speak Celtic or understand Celtic? Interesting to think about. Omen is a plain blah blah blah. The gradual drying up. I already said that there's no evidence that this is imposter. His farm and the surrounding country have been thoroughly canvassed by the adherents and detractors of the stone. Oh, the shock desk hat Brock. Love your. Thank you so much for the donation, man. Apologize for mutilating your name there. 165 of you in here. Welcome again, everybody. Episode 21. Appreciate you being here. Gonna try to speed up a little bit through this. So you know, he was given a lot of shit, and it was called a fraud, just like all the other rune stones. And the crazy thing, as I've shown, many of these rune stones disappeared, and the Smithsonian came and collected all of them. It was actually like a blessing in disguise for some of these stones to be deemed fraudulent or to be found by somebody that wouldn't give them up. It's a miracle that a stone like this could travel to Chicago and all these different places and universities and make its way back here. And yeah, and there be a record of it still for us to talk about today. So I'm going to skip ahead here. Basically, they go on and on. They talk about more comparisons. They go on to talk about Vinland through the Hudson Bay, which is kind of what I was mentioning, that there Vinland again. Vinland on some maps was described as, you know, the far eastern part of Canada, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. In some cases, yeah, in the Hudson Bay routes, and you know, the rivers being quite a bit larger, and obviously there's a lot of evidence that they were navigated by all kinds of cultures, not just the Norse. They point out the Hudson Bay route had been known to the Hudson Bay Company. Yeah, of course. I mean, fur traders were coming that way into Minnesota and Michigan long before they were coming up the Mississippi. In this connection, is interesting to note that on the shores of the Bay of Fundy, opposite the town of Yarmouth, is a large stone weighing more than 400 pounds. 400 years, the people accepted its ancient origin, but only recently has it been deciphered. The sentence on it reads, Harco, son, addressed the men, and in an account of the expedition of, I'm not even going to try, in 1007, the name of Harkel is mentioned. The letters AVM on the Kensington stone have naturally caused much discussion. It is generally accepted that they stand for Ave Marin, and it is pointed out that at the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, the Virgin was often called upon, and in a poem of the period, every verse ends with this supplication. Masonic secret advanced. So this is interesting. We've talked about the overlays here with the masonry and how, you know, the Dakota Indians, they wore, you know, the Masonic apron everybody's familiar with, in their ceremonial garb, right? As I kind of showed you some pictures there, and hopefully I can pull up the picture I'm talking about. You know, the Indians wore aprons just like the Masons, and the Masonic symbols. Even the Masons of the 1800s said the oldest examples of the Masonic symbols were found in the Americas, Arizona, California, Colorado, and down into Mexico. Anyways, this has a big connection with Celtic too. Again, many overlays. Most ingenious theory has recently been advanced by a Mason who in a long article suggested the letters are AUM and not AVM, on the theory that U and V are interchangeable in Latin and W would be difficult to carve on stone. He contended that they mean the mystic word of great antiquity. Remember, we found on shells in Tennessee, AUM on shells in Tennessee, and a carving of a crouching figure or kneeling, sitting, much like the Buddha, on shells, stone. So the thing is really interesting. They mean the mystic word of great antiquity known to masonry and brought from India, and that the Norsemen knew the potency of this word and used it in their danger with all its hidden meaning. The non-believers assert that no party could in 14 days reach so far into the interior. Now, again, I disagree, especially when we're, as I'm starting to do in my other series, show that could Vinland have actually been this entire region, and Norumbega, this um, city that's been wiped off the map, have been its capital. So yeah, so basically, their whole reason for disregarding this, for the most part, is that they say, "Oh well, 14 days they couldn't have reached Minnesota from Vinland in 14 days." Well, again, rising waters, and we're going to show an article where not far from this rune on another farm, they found a boat, a quote Viking boat. At any rate, it is generally agreed that the inscription, false or genuine, was made by a Swede or an unlettered man, probably from the south part of Sweden. It looks like the work of an explorer of the 14th century or the fabrication of a philologist familiar with the dialect of certain parts of Sweden at the time. The advocates think that mistakes could easily be made by unlettered people and that obsolete words, which were in use in the 14th century, as well as numerical characters, could have been carved by a modern faker. Mr. Holland avers he finds added confirmation to his theory of the genuineness of the runes by the fact that Mandan Indians have been a puzzle to scientists. Now, you've heard me talk about the Mandans before. I've posted quite a lot about them on my Twitter over the years. The same gentleman who did the carvings or the paintings of these Indians, he's got a book with, hundreds. He also painted the Mandan Indians. And in his diary, he was kind of caught off guard because he said that Celtic, here we go again, was easily understood, Welsh, and that he called them the Welsh Indians, and that many women among their tribe had fair skin, blue eyes, and some even had red hair, blonde and red hair, fair skin, blue eyes, could speak Welsh. Okay. In old publications, the Mandans are called Mandanes. There's an E on the end. So the actual oldest writings of the Indians, where they're called Mandane, right? Space, Mandane, right? The Danes. Many of these Indians have the light hair of the Swedes, and their ideas of heaven and hell are identical with those current among the Norsemen in early days. Heaven being a warm place, and hell furnishing plenty of cold. This is identical with the Bach saga in the Finnish lore, the Kalevala, and even the Etruscan mythos has the exact same idea that heaven is a warm place, the inversions, and hell. This is why Helsinki is called what it is. So again, making big connections here. The Finns, we can connect this with the Celts. We can connect this with the Phoenicians and so many other things. But yeah, they also use a decimal system similar to the numbers of the Kensington stone. This theory, however, must not in any way confound the rune stone with the pictographs used by the Indians of our Southwest, where rocks and walls of caves are carved with signs and pictures. There are many of these showing remarkable skill in drawing in Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. Now, again, we can look back through Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and yes, there are pictographs, there are hieroglyphics. They found Latin and they found Celtic. So there are many other languages outside of the pictographic in those regions that correlate with this whole thing as well. But they are entirely to be yes. These letterings called runes are usually on stone, though some have been found on tombs, swords, arrows, and cooking utensils. Such ancient inscriptions have been seen in England, Scotland, Ireland, Greece, and Italy. Yeah. And Etruscan overlays there are really quite amazing, and they tie in with Finnish as well. Remember that towards the end of the episode, we're going to dive into some philology language books, and we're going to show some really interesting overlays between Celtic, um, Proto-Phoenician, so to say, which you stem Celtic from, Welsh, Sayu, Chippewa, and Dakota languages, and how they have many interchangeable words. Many of these are preserved in royal museums and libraries. Some in England, some serve in royal museum. Yeah, some in England are on crosses, evidently erected over the dead. Old worm, and remember, we found several of those in Arizona. Crosses with Celtic or runic-like inscriptions. The Danish antiquarian dragged these curios, markings of obscurity. Blah blah blah. I think we're just going to call it good there. Yeah. So again, if this is the first time you've ever heard of the Kensington runestone, I suggest you look it up. As you know, you're going to find much better representations of it, and there's quite a lot of really interesting information that's been written on it as of late. You'll get a better picture of it. Again, not a black and white newspaper photocopy, but as that is kind of my method, that's where we're at. Yeah. So we'll read through chat real quick. Try to do that a little bit more. 183 of you. Welcome again, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Finland State Forest, Minnesota. Yeah. Yeah, there was a quite a awesome. I can't remember the name of the city. I should. It was outside of Duluth, but it was like 90% Finnish. You know, um, no coincidence there. Serpent Wisdom. Ah, yeah. Oh yeah, Serpent Wisdom for sure. We'll get into that some more. Fears for children. Okay. Um, kind as a dove and wise as a serpent. Yeah. What am I missing? Pew, 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 pew. Maritime archaic. Yeah, he knows what's up. The Mandans, Welsh Indians. You know what's really amazing? And I'm just going to share this because I know most of you probably haven't seen my posts about the Mandans. The Mandans, the earth is flat. Okay. The Mandans, their ancestors lived underground after a calamity of some sort. And they climbed a giant beanstalk that broke through the surface, and that's how they ended up on the outer surface, as they call it. So they believe in an inner world where they climbed a giant beanstalk to the outer surface. Um, yeah, super interesting. I always love that story. You know, Jack and the Beanstalk and giants, and there's just yeah, so many overlays there, especially as we get deeper into the kind of giant story. But yeah, so this one is again a bit of an overlay, and I'm going to highlight just a few of these. It's called Minnesota's Story. Long before the white man's era dawned in the region now called Minnesota, even long before the red man had tracked the forest and prairies into a network of trails and plied his busy paddle on almost countless lakes and streams, the mound builder was constructing his curiously interesting earthworks and was making his pathways to and from his home and hunting grounds. The mounds of Minnesota contain considerable quantities of pipestone implements. So yeah, pipestone is really important because one of the best quarries in all of this region along the Mississippi or Missouri uh, was in was in Minnesota, and that Indians traveled for hundreds of miles and met once a year at this quarry and made pipes. And even different bands that didn't necessarily get along, they were always at peace when they met at the quarry to build their pipes. And this pipe stone is found in Florida, Mexico, Canada. Again, it's the same trade network as the copper, the seashell ornaments, on and on and on. Shell ornaments and copper, just like I was just read over the article there. For the pipestone, it was necessary to journey to the southwest corner of the state. Some of the shells found in McKinstry Mounds, Itasca County, belong to the genera Nautica and Marginella, and must have been brought from the Gulf of Mexico or the coast of California. Yeah, incredible trade. But the most interesting suggestion concerning the transportation of materials buried in the mounds of Minnesota is found in the copper utensils and ornaments. Stray pieces of copper found in the glacial drifts doubtless furnished the mound builders with some of their material, but there is evidence that these people early learned to extract the metal from Lake Superior copper deposits. Therefore, journeys had to be made over trails and waterways to northern Michigan. It is more than probable that these Aborigines, in their migrations and in their quest for food, fur, pipestone, copper, and other desired materials, became the original trail makers in Minnesota, and these prehistoric people, in a measure, prepared the path for the historic Red Man. Now, you already know how I kind of feel about that. There's certainly been a event or two that has really changed the topography of this region, if not the entire uh, North American continent or the realm as a whole. Um, Buffalo made the trails again. I just kind of wanted to surmise there, talking about the pipestone and the trade networks. Um, yeah, and for the sake of time, we're just going to keep moving forward. Again, north of Norumbega. Yeah, Vinland. I'm assuming that's what we're talking about. JC Mandan is a class. JC. I'm sure I'm missing something there. Giant trees, giant beanstalk. Absolutely, Paul. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at too. 100%. Um yeah. You know how many of these cultures talk about being taken underground during these tumultuous times on the surface? And yeah, very interesting. Okay. Prehistoric. What appears to be a rare specimen of prehistoric remains was unearthed near here when the skeleton of a human being and some earthen and stone vessels were found and brought to the city by S.S. Stadsvold, proprietor of the Foston flour mill, and Louis Loan, cashier of the Bank of Foston. Messrs. Stodville and Lawn were visiting at Mr. Lawn's farm near Beaulieu on the border of White Earth Indian Reservation and were watching some workmen who were making a cellar for a new building. The men had gone some depth into the side of a hill, the intention being to make a large root cellar, when the shovel of one of them came into contact with a hard substance which gave forth a metallic sound. The workmen stooped to examine what the obstacle was and found it to be an iron ring fastened to something further in the side of the hill. Pulling on the ring disclosed the fact that it was attached to an iron door and swung outward, disclosing a large opening. Looking into the opening, it was found that it led to a large cave, which was strewn with pieces of broken stones of peculiar shapes, and in one corner was a stone box, in which, on being opened, was found the perfect skeleton of a human being. Some stone implements representing hammers, arrow darts, and other peculiar implements were also in the box. The skeleton was at least 7 feet in length. Mr. Lone has placed the skeleton and the other articles in a sealed glass receptacle and put them with a rare collection of Indian relics which he possesses. It is believed that the cave was once the resort of the mound builders or of the Indians in a very long ago, as the implements found here are of very ancient pattern. And the iron door. Yeah, a lot to that one there, huh? I think we have one more about that iron door that I really like. The New York Herald published a few days since a letter from St. Anthony, Minnesota, giving an account of a remarkable cave that has been discovered in the city. It stated that a man, while digging out earth in the cellar of his house, which stood on a limestone bluff, found an iron trap door, which, being opened, revealed a flight of steps cut in the solid rock. He descended them and found several spacious apartments, in which were a stone altar and various relics indicating that human sacrifice had been perpetrated there. Remains were also seen, indicating that the cave had been a place of resort, probably for purposes of human sacrifice by the mysterious race which preceded the Indians in the habitation of our continent. The outlet of the cavern, though blocked up by falling stones, obviously opened on the high banks of the river. The story poemed very doubtful, and our suspicions were apparently confirmed by the denial of the St. Anthony correspondent of the St. Paul Pioneer of any such cave being known to exist. Mr. Rubin of St. Anthony, however, writes that St. Paul Press, saying that the Herald's account is true and unexaggerated, and that the matter has been purposely kept secret until the explorations shall have been completed. The letter to the Herald having been unauthorized. So this is kind of like the Rock Island discovery that I covered in Iowa, just off the coast of Davenport there. Same thing. The exploration was unauthorized, and further exploration was no longer allowed, and Eastern people took control of the island, and the Smithsonian again was notified. So a kind of similar feeling we're getting here, that the newspapers were told to keep it a secret, and the Herald was unauthorized in posting the last thing I shared with you there. So yeah, they kept it a secret until they could finish exploring the caves. So how much farther did they go? You'll notice that Minneapolis and St. Paul and a lot of these cities are built on these bluffs, these limestone bluffs. And I've talked a lot about these limestone bluffs where you have cities built on cavern cave systems. Minneapolis being a perfect example. In fact, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the architects were well aware of this, and they were actually building huge stone and concrete support beams under the city of Minneapolis in these huge caverns. So anybody, in Minnesota, that's been to Minneapolis, that entire city is built on literally a huge cave system. And we'll get into that article later, I think. But yeah, so by personal inspection of these wonderful relics and the subterranean mention of a past age, and which may be truly pronounced prehistoric, I propose to extend an invitation to the governor and the members of the legislature to visit them soon after they next assemble. So yeah, again, someone stepped out of line and posted an article about this, and he wasn't supposed to. And yeah, not the first time we've read that before. Yeah, so where are we at? Art of Dino. Look at it. Look who it is. We finally crossed paths. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. This man's made so many videos about my old posts before I ever had a YouTube channel. Lots of good material there. Let's see. Okay, we're under an hour now, and obviously time is precious, and I have a lot of material to get to. So we're going to start skipping stuff. So forgive me ahead of time. Okay, let's go to Race of Giants. Yeah, and then from there, yeah, okay. Let's do that. So yeah, again, apologies. We're going to start kind of jumping around. Greg Carlwood walks away from giant trees, but not me. Oh yeah. I'll get him on the giant tree stuff, whether it's giant silica formations or giant root systems, we'll get there. Hopefully that could be our next talk, round 4. We get into more of the Titanic past. But yeah, Race of Giants. A party in Minneapolis, relic hunters, came home a few days ago from a trip into northern Minnesota. They went away on October 27th and spent most of the time in camp 5 miles above Pine City, at the point where Snake River cuts into Lake Pokegama. Here they found in largest quantities the Indian and prehistoric or mound builders' relics for which they were seeking. There were in the party Judge W. H. Adams, Sinclair Botkin, Higgins, and J. A. Rithensole, and they tell an interesting story of their trip. Northern Minnesota is comparatively rich in these finds, not rich when compared to the great prehistoric mound territory in Ohio or Mississippi, but rich as far as the Northwest is concerned. Arrow points, stone axes, mauls, and pottery fragments were picked up on the trip referred to, as well as a splendid specimen of tempered copper. As most of these relics are in the water, it is cold work securing them at this season of the year. The members of the party waded in hip boots, patiently back and forth over the same territory dozens of times, plunging their bare arms at frequent intervals into the water, and scraped the mud and sand at the bottom of the elusive relic. Mr. Worthenson regards his tempered copper spearhead as one of the finest specimens in existence. Again, the tempered copper is really important because the way they tempered the copper, we still didn't even understand to this day. The art of tempering copper, alas, is lost, and the people of this prehistoric civilization have the advantage over their modern successors in this regard, at least. A stone pestle for pounding grain was also found. It was evidently made by a skillful workman, as it is perfect in every point and a very fine specimen. A stone wedge that forms part of the collection is about 7 inches long by 4 inches wide. It was worked down to the desired size and shape from a cobble stone. A group of mounds was photographed, and one of them was opened, disclosing many fragments of pottery, arrow points, charred wood, human and animal bones, copper trinkets, tooth ornaments. Judge Adams is something of an authority when it comes to prehistoric relics, and for years has given more or less time and attention to the subject. He has visited all the points in the Northwest where these relics are to be found, and was the natural leader of the expedition, like that which just returned from Lake Pokegama. There are a few places in northern Minnesota, he says, where these relics and mounds are found in limited numbers. The mounds contain the same pottery and flint that are found in the prehistoric Mandans on the Missouri River, south from Mandan, North Dakota. I inspected these Mandans in 1865 and find that the mounds in northern Minnesota are similar as regards to the general plan of fortification, the form, and the general character of contents. So, kind of like we were mentioning very early on when we talked about the comparison, that we're not just dealing with burial mounds; that in many cases we're dealing with buried habitations, right? And when you hear stories about, like in the previous article where they mentioned hundreds of mounds, they counted hundreds of mounds. Just like in Colorado, I think is the best example, and New Mexico, where, you know, they found that many of the mounds were actually just buildings, and that these buildings, when they went down deep enough, were all interconnected, and that you're kind of dealing with kind of a parapet or a higher portion of the building. Some of you may remember one of these buildings was 6 miles long, continuous in Colorado. Another in New Mexico had 3,000 rooms. Again, the biggest ancient buildings, quote, ancient, ever found in this realm were in Colorado and New Mexico. 3,000 rooms, one 6 miles long, continuous. So, how big are some of these buried, quote, villages? You know, there's a reason that a lot of these mounds were secretly destroyed or they were turned into parks. Yeah, kind of like again the St. Louis, the Missouri episode really blows the whole thing out of the water for me. That when they dug deep enough, that they found the mounds were stone, cut stone, hewn stone, and were connected to an underground existence, underground subterranean tunnels that connected all of these mound systems. The Minnesota mounds have fewer animal and human bones, however, and there are other differences of important detail. In one mound on Sayou River, we found the skull of a mountain lion and a human skull twice as large as the skull of the average man of today. Again, I found the skull of a mountain lion and a human skull twice as large as the skull of the average man today. Femurs and arm bones found at Snake River and on the Missouri River also indicate that these mound builders were giants. In one case, the thigh bone reached halfway to my ankle, and the bone of the forearm was long as my entire arm. Now, this is why that's a great one. Again, I love the giant stuff, but this next little part here is just fantastic, especially for a man in this time frame to be saying this. I imagine these people were fire worshippers, descended, it may be, from the old Persians or from the Montezumas. Again, who were allies with the Montezumas, the Seminoles, the Creeks, the Greeks. Many of the Seminoles had Irish surnames. Well, when you look at Persian history, Eri, land of the Ireland, Iran, the Aryan roots of the Persians and the fire worship, it's pretty crazy. The web connects. Upon each mound are large lamps of burnt clay, and the altars, which are built of stone back in the hills or on top of the stone butte, are in every instance surmounted by a red stone, corresponding to the burnt clay of the mounds. The pottery in the graves suggests, I think, that the mound builders believe in a future state. Evidently, they had the American Indian idea of a happy hunting ground and furnished their dead with provisions enough to last them until this blissful state is reached. Rice, really interesting. Rice was probably placed on the mounds in earthen vessels. Now, remember, in many of these previous articles, we've talked about mummy corn and mummy wheat. Mummy corn, mummy wheat. And that they planted some of this corn and some of this wheat and found that it grew to exceptional heights and was unlike any variety found on Earth today. So, not only are we dealing with giants, but we're dealing with giant agriculture. I'm also connecting that this is also the time frame of when we were in a completely tropical climate, all the realm wide. Omitting to giants, um, giant creatures, giant plants, on and on and on. Right, the megafauna period, isn't 500 million years old. So again, rice was placed in earthen vessels, which again, rice has been found in some of these mounds, which is in itself, quite an anomaly. This is probably one reason we find so few perfect specimens of pottery in these mounds, because the animals were trying to get at it. The gentlemen who have named are mild enthusiasts on the subject of prehistoric relics, and next summer may go to Missouri River for an inspection of some of the mounds there. The spot where they camped on the shore of Lake Pokegama was once the scene of a bloody battle between the Chippewa and the Sayou Indians in early days. The Chippewas owned the land, and before the commencement of the fight, stationed their squaws and papooses on an inland island in the lake. The day went against them, and the Sayou, after destroying the men, completed their work of blood by butchering the women and children. Heaps of bones on the island bear testimony to the truth of the story. Okay, we're not going to do that one. We'll just kind of bounce around and look at some comments again. Crypto Alchemist, good to see you. Thanks for being here. Justin Shades. Frank Ritchie, welcome. Huge rice. Yeah, huge rice. Huge, look at this rice. I'm from South Texas. Everyone knows greatest state in the U.S. Yeah, well, hopefully you watched my Texas episode, Rock and Rolla. Especially a lot of the Southern Texas stuff is crazy. Cali is full of mounds and ancient ruins. Yep, check out my Cali episode, guys. I toured a I toured a guy who was part of an American military engineering group who built an under glacier rail tunnel under the Greaseland ice shield with your tax dollars. Really interesting. I believe it. I believe it. On my tinfoil hat interview, I got into a little bit of my radium stuff, talking about the Germans using radium for their submarines and their dirigibles, and that they were uh, really their main goal was to fly dirigibles past the ice wall, but the storms were so great at those latitudes that the dirigibles stood no chance. So that's when they started designing the submarines, and that I believe they went under the ice. So funny you mentioned that. I love those ideas. That the Germans were just trying to get beyond the ice wall. Hello from Australia. Cheers. Oh, thanks. Cool. Thanks for joining me. Welcome from Australia. Oh, you did watch it. Cool. Awesome. I was thinking electroculture with such big vegetables. How interesting. Yeah, absolutely. I posted some pretty cool electroculture articles from the 1800s. It was definitely being used. Um, yeah, but I think there was more to it. Again, just like a hyperbaric chamber. Um, some of you may be aware that the Japanese were experimenting with hyperbaric chambers, in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And I believe they grew the world's largest tomato plant. And I can't remember the size of it, but it took up a whole building. And, it had like 900 tomatoes ripening on it. So hyperbaric, density, higher levels of oxygen, that's going to make for larger creatures. Um, all of these things, megafauna. That's what you need for it, right? Along with, again, whether or not we want to talk about titanic trees, but there's enough evidence in just those few things I mentioned to kind of to see the correlations there. But yeah, radium and all too. Hi Ben. Hey Lucy. Welcome. All right, back to it. Okay, skipping around. Okay, we're gonna touch on this one because it's a long one. Earth mound discoveries indicate tribes from Asia. Tribes from Asia lived here over 3,000 years ago. You know how I feel about this, in my Twitter post, I talk about one of the sacred Indian cities of the Sayoo, Kateo, the lost city of Catayo, Cathay. You know, um, Columbus, was he so stupid that when he landed in Cuba, he thought he was in China, or I don't know. We go far enough back on maps, and America is labeled not only India superior, but also Cathay, China. Anyways, earliest residents farmed and traded muck like modern people. This special article has been written for the Redwood Gazette by Ray E. Colton, globetrotter and archaeologist who is now engaged in the study of prehistoric Indian remains in Minnesota. In the following article, Mr. Colton, who has explored the relics of the ancients in Mexico, Egypt, and Central America, tells of what has been discovered regarding the early Aboriginal inhabitants of what is now the state of Minnesota and Redwood and adjoining counties. The Mound Builders Trail. Thousands of years previous to the colonization of what is now the continent of North America by European adventurers, another cultural race was busy establishing its cultural development, relics of which, in the shape of earth mounds, pottery, arrowheads, and human skeletal remains, have been found at various points in Redwood County and other portions of what is now central Minnesota. The study of these artifacts by competent archaeological and anthropological authority has revealed something which is hard to visualize. In view of the fact that over 3,000 years have elapsed since these people who left these mute relics lived here, the earth mounds reveal to us of today that there were skilled engineers among these ancient races who were able to construct artificial earth tumuli mounds, which down through the ages, have withstood the assaults of nature and the elements. So, again, if we can talk about mud flooded buildings in one breath, and plenty of articles now throughout this series showing that some of these are burial mounds, but many of them are buried buildings connected with huge cities if you go down deep enough, right? So, when we talk about um, kind of the burying of past ages, right? The disappearing, the disappearing, or the wiping of a race from the face of Minnesota or whatever state it is we're talking about. Um, that has to be on the table when it comes to discussing what really happened, what could have buried this particular area. But now, just about every state shows pretty strong evidence of some kind of a mud flood, whatever you want to call it, mud rain. Um, and it's not just volcanic. In some places, certainly it's volcanic. In other places, it's absolutely not. The relics also reveal that the mound builders, who were the first cultural race to arrive on the North American continent, again, I strongly disagree with that. I don't always agree with everything in these articles, but some of them, provide really good correlations with other material that we've shown throughout this. Were highly proficient in the art of pottery manufacture, and that though astronomical calculations, their seers and high priests were able to foretell solar disturbances and to advise the ancient farmers of these tribes just when to plant the crops when they grew in profusion. Many of these mound systems, whatever you want to call them, again, buildings, burials, are aligned astrologically. Many of them, undeniable. Even in that time of long ago, agriculture was carried on as people had to eat. The petrified remains of corn, wheat, and even tobacco, which have been found, are indisputable proof that agriculture was a large industry in the days of these ancient Aboriginal races who predated the present Indians and white races by at least 3,000 years. One need to just look at Arizona, right? The the Arizona and just the canal systems there alone could have fed, I can't remember what the gentleman said, 100 million people. So I'd say probably even more than that. Over a period of years since the first discoveries were made of mounds, of the mound builders, archaeologists and the lay public have been somewhat mystified as to just who the mound builders were of antiquity. Painstakingly working over this period, carefully checking and rechecking every angle as each new find was made, the secret of this once mighty ancient American race has been at last solved. Competent archaeological authority has determined the mound builders migrated from Mongolia by way of the Bering Strait. Again, caveat, I don't, that's not necessarily my belief. This migration is believed to have been one of the greatest ever attempted in prehistoric times and consisted of approximately 300,000 men and women and children of Asiatic origin. Arriving at a point in what is now the territory of Alaska, the migratory movements of the mound builders is believed to have been south by southeast. The first works of this strange race were discovered about 15 years ago near the city of Brandon, Manitoba, Canada. This find was in the shape of several artificial earth mounds, and from these mounds, Canadian archaeologists from the University of Toronto removed several pounds of arrowheads, some pottery vessels of strange design, and several complete skeletons of human origin. The greatest works of the mound builders appear near Newark, Ohio, where the great serpent mounds are the wonder of the archaeological world. Oh man, thanks, Paul. That's too kind. 20 gifted memberships. Very nice of you. Blessings. Thank you, Paul. So again, one need to just go back and look at episode 1. For anybody that hasn't seen episode 1 Alaska, I strongly recommend it after we finish this. You check that out. That sets the groundwork for just about every state we go into, because it covers the gamut from mound builders to giants to giant creatures, giant boats, petrified cities, cities frozen, you name it, right? And kind of changes the lens on what some of these people said about the mound builders, right? And the whole migration story. Um, but yeah, so like we mentioned earlier with the Mandans, something happened on the surface and they were forced underground. Many other cultures tell this same story. The Lenape, um, the Navajo, on and on and on. Probably a dozen or more say the earth began to shake and tremble, and that's when they knew it was time to go underground. And then they came back to the surface. Somehow they found out it was safe. I'm going to skip ahead because this is, again, a really long one. The empire of the mound builders is believed to have spread from a point near the Ohio West Virginia state line south to northern Tennessee and thence west from far as Fort Smith. Now, again, you all know that we're not just looking at one particular race or subset of races or types of people. We've covered pygmies, we've covered giants, we've covered dwarfs. And I've said so many episodes now that when I look at Tolkien, who was obsessed with the Finnish lore, the Kalevala, which overlays with the Etruscan mythos, which overlays with the Celtic mythos, which overlays with many of these, quote, Native Americans, that you find that his fiction is closer to the truth than I would say just about anything else out there. Crazy as that sounds. That's my takeaway, now 20 plus episodes in, is that truth is stranger than fiction. And if you want a really good visual representation of what Earth or America was like before these cataclysmic upheavals, just watch Lord of the Rings. Crazy, I know. Crazy, I know. But that's how I feel. Minnesota, the largest works of the mound builders have been unearthed near Puo, north of Brainerd. And from these mounds, there have been taken many remains of mound builder skeletons, together with excellent designs of pottery vessels and large amounts of arrowheads and stone axes. Most of these axes have a distinct mongoloid makeup and correspond almost identically with similar artifacts of this nature, which have been found among the present natives of the Upper Mongolian country in Asia. Tartar, Manchu overlays. Keep that in mind as we get into the language. An anthropological examination of the skeletons which have been unearthed shows their similarity with not only skeletons of Mongoloid origin, but also with of present-day American Indians, which have been found at various points. And again, they're narrowing this down. Perhaps that's all they're finding in Minnesota, but again, just look back through the archive of work of Anomalous America, and we know that that's not the case at all. They're finding everything under the sun: 12-foot tall, sloped foreheads, mongoloid, almond-eyed, dark hair, curly hair, red hair, 3 feet tall, dwarf, on and on and on. The part that I really wanted to focus on, for the sake of time, again, I'm skipping ahead. Black hair, inverted eyes, blah, blah, blah. That's not always what they find. It's quite different than that. We've shown again through not only Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, especially. They find so many different varieties. It's crazy. This latter race now inhabits the state of New Mexico. We talk about the Chinese overlays that existed in Arizona, right? That Casa Grande was actually built identically to Peking City, right? The Tartar capital, China. One that city is still alive and well today. So again, just take a look at old drawings of Peking, China, and think that an exact copy of that was built here in Arizona, Casa Grande, and that there are Chinese, quote, Chinese hieroglyphics found all the way down into Peru. So, what is Chinese again? And these are all things I've covered in many of my other series. Along the Minnesota River in the vicinity of Redwood Falls, several traces of earth, fortifications, again, really important because we're not just talking about burial mounds. Mounds appear to be trained archaeological eye. So we've covered fortifications, star forts, many of these, and just about every episode as well. And hopefully we'll have time to get to one here. We are getting low on time. Holy smokes. Okay, let's just skip to the part I wanted to read. It has been definitely determined that the mound builders were great traders, that their skiffs are believed to have gone as far south as the rivers in Texas, and from these points, loads of merchandise were landed and carried on foot clear down to the Yucatan. Now, um, this has been kind of destroyed as well because they found petrified canoes of wood only found in the northern states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, as far south as um, um, the southern parts of the Gulf of Mexico. I'm spacing the names of that part of the Yucatan. So yeah, the huge canoes are found all over the Gulf of Mexico. They're found all the way down into South America as well. Michael Brown, thank you for the 99. I appreciate it very much. Um, The merchandise was landed and carried on foot clear down into the Yucatan Peninsula from Mexico. Remember, you could take a canoe all the way to Mexico City, and you could take a canoe all through the Yucatan. Water levels were higher. You could take a canoe and travel all the way around Florida. The entire state was traversable by canoe. Um, yeah, so raise the water levels, more rivers, bigger rivers, deeper rivers connecting more places. Yeah. Blah 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 blah. Again, I apologize for skipping ahead even more. Uh, Last year, Missouri Valley, Iowa, Dr. Richard of Omaha, Nebraska, while searching for mound builders' relics, unearthed a stone smoking pipe, which, upon close examination, was found to bear the design of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, Kukulkan. The overlays with the Celtic there, again, the plumed serpent, the serpent class, druids, Brahmins. I have a fantastic book that we'll have to get into, kind of covering this quote serpent priest class, and it'll correlate again with the languages and the mythos here as well. The finding of this pipe so far from its native land gives archaeologists much food for thought. It shows that either the Aztecs were once here or the mound builders brought the pipe back with them after some expedition to the south. Yeah, and we'll stop there. And I'm just going to pick my favorites now. So, for the sake of time, relics of antiquity. This was a good one, but it's fairly long. If there's any questions or things you want to say, hey Ben, you could probably do a part two of 100%, and maybe I'll get there. Maybe Amy, maybe I'll get there when I'm done. I'll go back and I'll do a revisited. I was kind of mentioning some of that in the start of this episode. If there's something that you want to say or a question you have, um, maybe just type question in your question, and I'm going to do my best to spend about 5-10 minutes at the end engaging with you guys and answering or hearing your thoughts about future episodes or things I need to see or whatever. Nope, we're gonna skip that one. So I'm just gonna kind of do summaries. Present day medicine lodge of Ojibwe on the site of an ancient spirit lake village. The site of We, Ya, Kum, Iggs, Ojibwe village, again, I'm sorry, was located at a little town called Lawrence at the south ends of Mille at a beautiful bay dotted with the islands and having all the peculiarities of maple timber region with rich soil and nomenclature, which indicated the occupancy of an Indian nation for a long period of time. So basically, what this is this is a medicine lodge, and this is um, the medicine man's carving, basically his layout of how he would go about healing in this medicine lodge. Mysteries explained. The object of this article is to describe some of the peculiarities of the present day existing among the Ojibwe people, who by the force of arms have become the successors of the Spirit Lake villagers, so called because of the mysteries of the region, were sufficient to create a doubt in the minds of the people who resided there as to the true character of the waters of the lake. It was finally determined to pay Wa Ig a visit at Sagawamik Bay, where every arrangement had been made to celebrate the mysteries of the medicine dance for the purpose of initiating 7 candidates into the various ceremonial performances which the Ojibwe people were in the habit of conducting once a year. Skipping ahead, it seems that there were only one Indian in the Ojibwe nation who was able to give the last word and the highest sign, which constitute the final instruction in the lodge. By a mere accident, through no fault of the writer of this article, the very old man and worn birch bark chart of the medicine lodge came legitimately into his hands. So, yeah, this is a chart that's carved onto a piece of bark that explains how to do the ceremony, and it's quite interesting, this healing ceremony. And for the sake of time, I won't get into it. Um, this one talks about diamonds being found in many localities throughout Minnesota. Super interesting. Just like many of the mound builder sites, diamonds are found. They were found all over Arkansas, um, some parts of southern Tennessee. They were found in some mounds. Very rare, very special. But some of these people had diamonds in their masks or their chest plates. Very interesting. That's what this one goes into. Talks about diamonds being found. Minnesota, 45 miles from the mouth of Big Fork River, which empties into the Rainy in northern Minnesota, are many ancient mounds whose origin extends beyond the traditions of the Ojibwe. Until recently, these mounds were inviolate, or they are in a wild region, but little visited by white men and reached only by canoe. One summer, however, a party of scientists from the University of Toronto came out to explore them. From one of the mounds on which a sturdy oak was growing, there it is again, a human skeleton perfectly preserved was exhumed. It was not that of an Indian, and in the cavity whence it was taken were evidences of a prehistoric civilization in the form of articles of pottery, some stamped with unique and beautiful designs. Around the skeleton's neck was a massive band of pure copper, and on its bosom rested a curiously wrought necklace of the same metal, into which were interwoven shells and colored stones. Goes on and basically just says testing proved that it was diamond, clear quartz and diamond woven into a copper necklace. Crazy. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about language now. I didn't really want to skip one of the articles that got into the language stuff, but we're going to do that. We're going to skip because that's what we have to do. Never enough time. There we go. So this book is called Atlantis: The Evidence of Science by Emmett John Sweeney. Okay, and since we've already talked about the Aztecs, we've talked about Quetzalcoatl, blah blah blah, on and on. To the ancient Berbers, Atla apparently meant water region. Again, Atla is water in so many cultures of the Americas. It's insane. We have already shown too that word variously rendered as Atlea or Atalea, implying a mountain or sacred hill, is found throughout the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and Mexico. The ancient home of Quetzalcoatl, according to the Mexican legend, was Tulan, apparently a variant of Atlan. The Spanish even found upon their arrival on the Panama coast a settlement called Atland. The mysterious founders of the first Mexican civilization, the Toltecs, who were associated with the city of Tulan and who are said to have been white skinned, also appear to have a name that is, in part at least, a variant of Atland. The first two consonants, T and L, form the root atoll. Yet this is the only word of very many that appears to have made the voyage across the ocean in pre-Columbian times. Donnelly listed scores of these, right? Donnelly does a great job of this. You know, I don't always agree with all of Donnelly's stuff, but Ignatius Donnelly, Atlantis, he does a good job with philology. In particular, to some striking parallels between the languages of the Sayu and the Mandan and various old world people. The linguist and author Charles Berlitz, following the trail blazed by Donnelly, listed dozens more of such terms. Vocabulary is a minefield. I agree. However, there is no doubt that many of the parallels can be put down to pure coincidence. Now, I disagree with the pure coincidence part. especially again, I've done so many things tracing things back to, Celtic, Proto-Celtic, Phoenician, Proto-Phoenician. Um, yeah. Thus, the Nahuatl Aztec word "tio," meaning God, sounds like the Greek "theos" and the Latin "dios." The parallel maybe a coincidence. I don't think so, especially again the work I've done on the Creek and the Greek. On the other hand, we need to remember that Indo-European peoples much closer to the Atlantic seaboard, such as the Celts, had a similar word for God, dia. Yeah, and so an influence cannot be ruled out. Indeed, the early Celts, particularly the Irish Gaels, were in the closest contact with the Berber Atlantean civilization, and the two may be said at one time and in one location to have formed a common cultural identity. Yeah, just like the Basque and the you know who, right? The Micmac, just like the Celts and the Etruscans, and the Etruscans and the Finns, and the Sioux and the Celts, and blah, 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 blah. There were also strange echoes of English, especially Old English. Old English, I've talked about the transitory period. There's three stages of English, and many people are aware of strange similarities between Old English Wiccan, where we derived the word witch, meaning sacred or magic, and the Sioux word Wakan. I've done so many posts over Wakan, Wakanda, all of that. It exists in endless Aboriginal cultures, quote, Indian, Native American cultures, as well as found all over the world, meaning essentially the same thing, but it was the similarities with Welsh that caused the most comment. So striking were some of these that a whole cottage industry developed claiming a Welsh origin of the Mandans and suggesting that this people were descendants of the medieval Welsh prince Madoc. So again, even the Mandans say themselves that they were two tribes that came together and intermarried. So there was two languages. So they could understand and speak Welsh, but their version of it had changed over time. Just like the tribe that they intermarried with, whatever their original root form of language, it varied over time. That's how all of these things happen. Tribes and people intermingle, intermarry, trade with each other, and all of it's just a constant churning of the waters of language. A few of the wilder propagandists even begin to suggest that the Mandans spoke Welsh and that the Welshmen were able to converse freely with them, each using his own language. Such claims are, of course, complete nonsense. But, like I had stated, there were Celts in Minnesota hiring Sioux guides hunting parties who they said they could converse freely with. And there are many, many other examples of this. Nevertheless, the list of similarities reproduced below is indeed impressive and needs to be viewed in context of the very real DNA evidence for an ancient European link with the Mandan Sioux, because it's not European. It's not European. European blood is a mixture of this ancient root over here in the Americas with the Mandan Sioux. So here we are. We have a comparison here. You can pause me if you want to look at this a little bit better. English, Mandan, Welsh, how it's pronounced. And then down here we have a comparison of Dakota and Sioux with other languages. And these are just a few. Barry Fell has quite a bit of more evidence into this. Max Mueller does a really good job of covering this. There are tons of books out there, guys. And I'm going to show one more here. The language of the Dakota and the Sioux. If you want a whole book, 30 pages, but not an easy read, where you can get a really deeper dive into this. You can check out this book, The Language of the Dakota, the Sioux Indians. And again, I could start from the beginning of this chapter, which would probably be the right thing to do, the language of the Dakota and the Sioux, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. We're going to hop down here. The foregoing is... Where can I... Okay. Or it may also happen that when several synonyms expressions originally existed in what we call a mother language, which I've discussed a lot, Phoenician, there's there are many examples. Paleo Hebrew, which again was just the priest language of the Finns. They have become so scattered in their descent that only one of these words is found in a certain one and is derived, just as they kind of were mentioning earlier, that through the muddying of the waters, dialects, and all these things, tongues change. The foregoing is sufficient to account for the frequent failures in establishing the relationship of certain languages in regard to the affinity of all their words. On this occasion, it will be enough to mention in passing, as it were, one or two of the most frequent used words, such as the names of father and mother. In regard to these most familiar expressions, we again find a surprising coincidence between the tongues of Upper Asia. Remember, as we were discussing this kind of Banglo Asiatic relationship, extensively viewed the Ural Altaic, which has a very strong relation to the Ural Finnic, Finnish root, which has Chinese interminglings as well as Etruscan interminglings, or the Tartar Finnish stock of languages, as the Dakota. Father is in Dakota 8, in Turco-Tartar Ata, Mongolian its branches Etsi, Etsij. In the Finnish language, we meet with the forms Eshi, Eti, they all having at and et as their radical syllable. Now, as to mother, it is in the Dakota language Ina, and in the Asiatic tongues just mentioned Anna, which it is in the Celtic as well, and they get into that furthermore. The female energy, mother. So again, I hate to just blast through those, but I gave you the titles if you're interested in diving into those a little bit more. We're going to do just a few minutes of some short ones here. This article here talks about this tribe says that their most ancient Indian village was called Kateo or Katheo. And here I show a map from the 1500s, which again, they don't have the Great Lakes here. And isn't this funny that Canada's listed as a desert? Canada, the desert. You have pygmies over here, Tangut down here, by again I'm estimating, Utah, Arizona area, and then kind of here in the Minnesota, Iowa area, Katai. And here you have the ancient Sayu Ojibwe calling the ancient city of Kateo, which is no one could find remnants of. Giants buried standing straight up. This is kind of what I was talking about. Another article where they say these aren't just mounds; they seem to be habitations. Grass mounds along the trail indicate that the Indian graves, the tribe that buried its dead on top of the ground. Right? How does that make sense? So, did ground level change? The skeletons were standing upright and were those of both sexes. Jawbones of the male were found to be almost twice the size of that of the ordinary man of today, just like the skeleton of the article we shared earlier. Indian war prophet. This is really interesting. They ask this kind of prophet of an Indian tribe to describe the history of the mounds, and I'll summarize. Previous to the occupancy of this country by the Dakotas, it was the possession of a race of giants whose customs resembled our own. In planting the seed of the squash, they drew the earth together, forming a hillock on the summit of which they deposited the seeds. Sounds just like Jack and the Beanstalk, similar to the Mandan origin story of coming from the underground to the surface. These mounds are the remains of the Squash Hills. Reminds me of the Colorado stuff with the giant seeds they found. The acorns as big as bowling balls. Extinct giants. Okay. No, we're not going to do that one. I want to do this one. Fossilized Viking ship. So, not far from that tablet that we talked about earlier, they found a few farms away the subsequent discovery of a fossilized rib of a Viking boat with wrought iron nail in it near the same spot, and the discovery in Norway of an inscription with a similarly formed A have revived interest in the matter. They're talking about that tablet. The iron ore deposits of Minnesota, and I showed you the pit mine pictures when I started the video, are of the Ordovician period and are approximately 500 million years old. Mr. Splinter explained these forms are now all extinct, but they have left behind them in the rocks casts of themselves. Even some of the original shells remain to tell us of their existence here millions of years ago, giving us testimony that Minnesota was once covered by tropical ocean, dotted with islands covered with tropical jungles. Man, I had a whole article on Fort Snelling that I wanted to get into. This is an incredible fort, one of the most amazing ones on the Mississippi. Incredible. Um, and it's built on, again, the kind of same limestone bluff that we discussed earlier with the caverns that were hidden from the public and the author who wasn't supposed to write about it who got in trouble. Um, the, 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 the old fort cave. So this is even written about a cave that existed below Fort Snelling, miles of tunnels, just like a lot of the old forts we've covered in Missouri, on the Missouri and the Mississippi. These quote forts, star forts, fortifications, even some of these mounds were labeled as such. Um, and the endless tunnels, just like these mound complexes, um, had endless tunnels underneath them. They were all connected. But yeah, all right, all right, guys, what do you think? It was a while since I asked for questions. I'm going to scroll up here and see if there is even any. What do you guys think? What stands out? What states are we looking forward to? Make sure to check out my Grammarica interview and stay tuned for my tinfoil hat episode. That should be out hopefully anytime. Ah, all right, we're rolling down. Finnish is Phoenician. Yep, perfect. Thank you, Jillian, for posting that. I've done a lot of videos where we just break down philology and we really get into the language stuff. And these quote Indian Aboriginal races are a huge hint. Why were so many of the Seminoles had Celtic surnames? Why did Cherokees have Celtic surnames? Why were Celtic surnames found on Indian tribes again in Minnesota and Wisconsin and more and more and more? All right, I'm just scrolling up to see if there's anything. Super chat got quiet. Yeah. I've been looking into the Texas Renaissance Festival. Okay. Okay. Doc on HBO. Love it. I'll check that out. Thank you, Lone Star. I'm recently just learning the Finger Lakes are basically the Great Lakes. Finger Lakes? Is that what you meant by legs? Finger Lakes? Finger Lakes? Ben is into whatever records exist in the ether, need to be held and highly. Thank you. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm glad you understand. I'm just trying, I don't want to say I'm not an entertainer, but that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to spike an interest and have fun with you guys. The Red Rock Amphitheater area in Colorado was geologically, it does not make sense. Okay. That area does get some intense weather, making growing food and overall living. Bop, 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 bop. The past is our future. Marion Cook released a great geology video on YouTube recently. Myron Cook, about the ancient ocean that once bisected North America from Canada to Mexico. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, basically the Great Lakes were just one big ocean. They connected all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, I'm Acadian, but my family buried its due. Oh, yeah, I got some Acadian blood, some Cajun blood on my mother's side. Um, yeah, whatever your ancestry is, be proud. 100%. 100%. It's what you do today, not what your ancestors did. Be proud, even if you come from a family of drunks or whatever, love them none the same. Joke. How about Virginia? Oh, it's coming. We're gonna get there. Another killer episode. Thank you guys. Living in a mound is just like living in a hobbit hole. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. Well said. 100%. I love it. Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to build the majority of your dwelling in the ground from a lot of standpoints. Lone Star. Why did so many Nordic people settle in Minnesota and Wisconsin? I don't know, because they missed the snow. They didn't want, they probably felt a little bit like home. Um, they're everywhere, really. There's a huge, there's a lot. There were a lot of Germans. There were a lot of Celts. This is the thing, though. In New York, there were a lot of Swedes. There were a lot of Irish. There were. So when they say there were only 6%, it's like, well, who were the rest? Americans? Like, how do you define an American in the 1800s? There were more German, Nordic, Celtic speaking people in the majority of the US than there were English speaking people in the 1800s. That's crazy. Wrap your mind around that. The majority of English, when the majority flipped, was actually the introduction of the schooling system and teaching English, which carried the majority of that with, you can look at the orphan train stuff and the industrial age, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole nother subject. But yeah. Hobbit Hole. Didn't see that, but that's awesome. Ben's work, blah, blah, blah. All right. Gonna wrap it up there, guys. Again, you don't have to have Twitter. There's a bunch of stuff I didn't talk about here. Whole thread here. The thread is in the description, so you can just click on it in the description of the video right now, and you can peruse through this and check things out at your discretion. Yeah, thanks for being here. Almost 200 people. Super grateful for that, and the gifted subs and the donations, blessings, means a lot to me. Yeah, I got some big announcements kind of in the work behind the scenes. I'm working on, maybe stepping down or even resigning at work, trying to give this my all. So stay tuned for that. More announcements to come. 2 weeks from today. What is that? Let's be sure, because I said that last time and I was on vacation. 24th. 24th. Yeah. Okay. 2 weeks from today, Anomalous America, Wisconsin. So add that to your calendar. Same time, same place. Love you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of your Monday night. Thank you so much for joining me. And I got some other series in the works. So stay tuned for more. And again, check out my Grammarica interview. It's free. And my tinfoil hat interview hopefully will be coming out within a week or so. So stay tuned. Love you guys so much. Again, blessings and thanks for everything. Bye, guys.